Good afternoon. Some time ago I read the American writer Robert Benchley, who remarked that the world can be divided into two sorts of people: those who divide the world into two sorts of people and those who don't. There's a lot of stereotypes around about all sorts of different things, but in Australia recently, some of the most common stereotypes have been about our welfare state. So what do I mean by the welfare state? The welfare state is all of the programs and policies that we have to protect people at different stages of their lives. So they include things like hospitals and Medicare, services for the frail aged, services for people with disability, and a wide range of social security payments, so age pensions, disability pensions, payments for carers and parents, payments for children, and also payments for the unemployed. Now, some of those programs are very popular, but when you add them all up, they account for more than half of what all levels of government spend in Australia. So they're the biggest set of items that the government provides. And as a result, they also account for about half of all the taxes we pay. As I said, some of those programs are very popular, but some are less popular. So we all like Medicare, and most of us seem to be in favour of age pensions. But in particular, payments for the unemployed and payments for people with disability and some of the other payments, we often see them as them versus us. Now, in different countries, different people have described the them and us in different ways. In the United Kingdom, media have talked about strivers versus skivers. Some politicians in the United States have spoken about makers versus takers. It's interesting they like to rhyme in both those places. In Australia, we've often had debate about lifters versus leaners, and also about taxpayers versus beneficiaries. It's the idea that the world can be divided into two sorts of people, into essentially the worthy and the unworthy. A lot of this is based on a misunderstanding of both the purposes of these social programs and how they're actually distributed. As I said, we often have a lot of stereotyping of people who are unemployed. The most common stereotype is that they're not actually looking for work. There's also people on disability support pension, and one of the most common stereotypes is that actually they're not really people with disability. One of the most amazing front pages on a newspaper, an Australian newspaper in 2014, at the beginning of 2014, this was literally the front page picture, which compared two images of a queue of young people on the left-hand side and a pretty iconic picture for those of us who are above a certain age of a wounded soldier being helped in New Guinea. And basically it pointed out that in New South Wales in 2014, the number of people who were on a disability support pension was nearly the same as the number of people injured in the Second World War. Now, statistically, this is actually sort of like comparing apples and pineapples. It's not a valid comparison. I won't go into why particularly, but I'm happy to talk to people about it later. But the main thing is that, well, what happened afterwards is the Press Council had an adverse judgment against the newspaper, not on the ground of statistical sloppiness, but on the grounds of not being an accurate depiction of what was happening in many people's lives. The other thing, I'm not sure you'll be surprised if I point out that the people on the left-hand side of this picture are not actually disability support pensioners in New South Wales. They're not actually in Australia. It's a picture of Swedish university students. But for the purposes of the comparison, it served the editors of the newspaper. But why do we have welfare provisions, including disability support pension? Now, there are a number of reasons for welfare. I'm going to talk mainly about the first two. There's the life course. It's been referred to earlier today. There are risks that people have in their lives. Social programs are also actually an important aspect of economic management, and of course they're also about reducing poverty and inequality. Now, everyone in this room, and in fact everyone in the world, and indeed everyone who ever lived, has at least one thing in common. We all started off life in the same way. We all started off life in a situation of complete vulnerability. We're all, for quite a number of years, dependent on our parents, and for most of us, not for all of us, our lives also end in vulnerability. So at the beginning of our lives and at the end of our lives, we have these pretty predictable periods when we're going to need the support of other people. The length of time that people need support, particularly in childhood, has increased over time as young people spend more time in school and education. And of course, lots of people are living longer. It's one of the great achievements of the 20th century. But more people are living to become frail elderly. Now, these life course, the life course is predictable, as I said. We know in advance that we're going to have these periods of predictability. But what's unpredictable are risks. Now, risks have been around, again, since the beginning of human history. So we have natural risks, and we've seen we have them today, so like hurricanes and cyclones, tropical storms, earthquakes, fires, floods and famines. So natural risks have been a part of human life since before we formed societies. But in addition, as we industrialised, particularly from the 19th century onwards, we created new risks. Our societies became a lot richer, but they also had new risks. As we built factories, there was always a risk of being injured on a farm, but we created the risks of being injured in the factory. We also created unemployment. Unemployment exists when we have advanced labour markets, when we have people who, as most of us do, and it's just been discussed, we spend most of our lives, a lot of our working lives in paid work. So we have these new risks, and in fact, over the course of the 19th century, different societies, as they got richer, developed mechanisms to deal with those risks. So the 8-hour day, as that has just been referred to, the 8-hour day was basically invented in Australia in the 1850s. We were the first jurisdiction to have the 8-hour day. And over the course of the 19th century, old age pensions were introduced, first in parts of Europe, but Victoria and New South Wales and New Zealand were also pioneers. So we developed these mechanisms to deal with risks. Now, what we also have, as I said, is the life course. If we look at the distribution of spending across the life course, these are estimates by people who at the time when they did it were at the ANU but are now at the University of Melbourne. This is an estimate of social spending by years of age. It's not in total how much gets spent, it's the average amount per person. You can see that it starts off with a bump in the early years, mainly because we have childcare, we have primary school and secondary school, and then universities and TAFEs. And then it's flat over the course of most people's working lives, but it starts to increase significantly after the age of 65. Now, on average, if you're 100 years or over, we're spending about $75,000 a year per person aged 100 years and over. There are only about 3,500 people over the age of 100 years in Australia, but we're spending about significant numbers on people under the age of 1. There are about 300,000 babies before the age of 1. So in fact, we spend a lot more at early ages than we do at older ages. But that's going to change over time as the population ages. Now, if you did a chart of taxes by age, what you'd find is the opposite of this. You'd find that we pay taxes during our working lives, and obviously children and people over 65 don't pay all that much in income tax, but they pay GST. But of course, the important thing is that children grow up, and when they get jobs, become taxpayers, and people over the age of 65 also used to be taxpayers during their working lives. Now, as I said, there are a range of risks. There are a range of risks that, just as we need to look at the distribution of spending across the life course, to understand the nature of risks, we need to look at what happens over time. And we need to follow people through time in order to assess the likelihood of risks. This is a series of snapshots of a boy and a young man from the age of 6 to 17. Those of you who have seen the movie Boyhood will know this is, in fact, is a series of stills from that movie. This is actually the same person who was filmed over 12 years. So he was an actor, but they kept coming back to him year by year and to make the movie. So there are certain sorts of statistics that essentially are movies. So in Australia, we have a survey since 2001 that's called HILDA. It's the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey. And what it's done is it's followed people in about 7,000 households every year since 2001. Every year it goes back to these people and it asks them about their income, it asks them about their earnings, their hours of work, it asks them about their health, it asks them about their wealth, and a whole range of other things. So if you were a 25-year-old at the start of the survey, you'd now be over 40. If you're a 50-year-old, you'd probably now be receiving an age pension. Now, when you follow people over time, you get a very powerful picture of what happens in people's lives. Now, when you do that, you find, as you follow people over time, there's some good news and there's some bad news. First, the bad news. Everything that can go wrong in people's lives is more common than we think over time. The good news is it's less intense than we think. It doesn't last as long. Now, what happens is that people experience periods of illness or injury. They experience unemployment. In HILDA, if you were over the first 10 years, something like 40% of individuals experience a serious illness or injury, and about 2/3 of house people also have a member of their immediate family or a close friend who experiences a serious illness or injury. When you look at the labour market, you find that the risks are even more common. We often think about the unemployment rate. The number of people who are unemployed each month at the moment is between 700,000 and 800,000. But over the course of a year, there's something like about 2 million people in Australia who experience a period of unemployment. There's about 4 million people who have a change in their labour market status. Either they move from part-time work to full-time work, or vice versa, or from unemployment or to employment, or vice versa. Now, when people's circumstances change, their incomes change, and that's when the social security system comes in. Now, again, when you look at the social security system, what you find is that over time, you get a very different picture of how many people are affected by social security. So if you look at the left-hand side of this chart, if you take the number of people who on the 30th of June are receiving a social security payment in 2015, amongst working age people below the age of 65, it was about 1 person in 6. Over the course of a year, about 1 in 3 households contain somebody who were receiving a social security payment. Now, HILDA, as I said, has been going for about 16 years. In the first 9 years of the survey, 2/3 of households in Australia included somebody who received a social security benefit at some stage. This isn't age pensions and it's not family payments. It's unemployment payments, youth payments, disability payments and carers payments. The most recent survey came out earlier this year and follows people over the first 15 years, and you can see the percentage goes up to about 70%. So the longer this survey goes on, the more common this is going to be. Now, the reason is, as I said, is that things change in people's lives. Now, the stereotype we have of people on welfare is that they're long-term welfare dependent. They're them. What you can see is if you look at this survey, the proportion of people who stayed on welfare and got virtually all of their income for 9 years is 1.2% of the population. So between the 2/3, or the 70% who pass through, and the 1.2% who stay on welfare for a very long period of time, there's enormously complicated patterns, which have to do with the enormously complicated patterns of people's lives. Now, what that means is that the idea of them and us is, in fact, we're all them, right? You know, this is going to happen to the vast majority of us over our working lives. Over our whole lives. The American economist, and he won a Nobel Prize for economics, Paul Krugman, described the American government as an insurance company with an army on the side. That essentially is what most modern states are, insurance companies with an army on the side. The reason why we need to move beyond the myth of them and us is that actually we're all in the same boat. We're all in this together.